Just after dawn on March 23, 2021, a container ship 400 meters long, a wall of steel stacked high with thousands of boxes, was shoved sideways by high winds and blowing sand inside the Suez Canal. Her bow ran into the eastern bank. Her stern swung around and grounded against the west. One ship wedged diagonally across one channel in the Egyptian desert, and the shortest sea road between Asia and Europe simply ceased to exist. For 6 days, nothing moved. More than 400 vessels dropped anchor at either end, tankers and grain carriers and box ships, while shipping analysts ran the numbers and estimated that nearly $10 billion worth of trade was now sitting still every single day, roughly $400 million an hour, waiting on one stock ship. That week, the world rediscovered something it had forgotten. By the most widely cited counts, roughly an eighth of everything humanity trades squeezes through this single man-made ditch. And here is the fact that should stop you cold. The artery of the machine age was not begun by machines. It was begun by hand, by peasant farmers marched out of the Nile Valley by the tens of thousands, cutting a trench through open desert with picks, hoes, and woven baskets, a full century and a half before anyone welded a container ship together. Picture one of them, a young farmer from the Delta, barefoot in the sand at the bottom of a cut that runs to the horizon in both directions. This is the story of what his hands started. The triumph had crowned, the man it destroyed, and the choke point had left the whole world holding.
Rewind a century and a half to an Egypt ruled by hereditary viceroys under a fading Ottoman Empire. The idea itself was ancient. Pharaohs and caliphs had cut waterways toward the Red Sea before, and the desert had swallowed every one of them. The man who revived the dream was not an engineer at all. Ferdinand de Lesseps was a French diplomat, a retired consul with famous charm, bottomless self-belief, and one priceless asset: an old friendship with the new viceroy of Egypt, Said Pasha. In 1854, Said granted his friend a concession to cut a canal through the Isthmus of Suez, and a second act 2 years later gave de Lesseps' company the right to operate it for 99 years once the water flowed, with a share of the profits reserved for Egypt. On paper, the plan was almost arrogantly simple. Panama, decades later, would demand locks, dams, and an artificial lake. Suez asked for none of that. The land lay so low and so flat that the canal could be cut at sea level, straight through. No locks at all, just one long trench, 100-odd miles of it, from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, through ground that held almost no fresh water and some of the harshest heat on Earth. Skeptics, and there were many, loudest in Britain, which wanted no French-controlled shortcut on the road to India, dismissed the whole scheme as a ruinous fantasy. On the 25th of April, 1859, on an empty shoreline that would one day become the city of Port Said, de Lesseps swung a ceremonial pickaxe into the sand, and the fantasy broke ground.
Now the digging had to be done, and Egypt paid for it in people. The system was called the corvée, and it was older than the pyramids. The state's standing right to conscript its peasant farmers, the fellahin, for public works. Village by village, men were drafted out of the Nile Valley and marched into the desert, tens of thousands at a time, in rotating shifts, month after month, year after year. Our young farmer from the Delta is one of them. He walks for days from green riverbank fields into a landscape with nothing alive in it. His tools are the ones his ancestors carried: a short pick, a hoe, and a woven basket of sand passed hand to hand up the slope of the cut. In those first years, there were almost no machines. The trench crawled forward on muscle. Water was the master problem. Every drop for a workforce of thousands had to be hauled in by camel and by barge, until the company cut a separate freshwater channel from the Nile just to keep its diggers alive. The men slept in sand camps, worked through heat and dust storms, and when cholera swept the works, Laborers died in waves while others fled into the desert. So how many died in those 10 years? The honest answer is that nobody knows. Egypt's rulers would later put the number at 120,000, a figure carved deep into national memory, though the records to prove it were never kept. Historians who have gone looking confirm only this: the fellahin were mobilized by the hundreds of thousands, and the dead are thought to run into the tens of thousands. The company's ledgers counted cubic meters. They never properly counted men.
In 1863, everything cracked. Said Pasha died, and his successor, Ismail Pasha, refused to keep marching farmers into the desert. Under mounting pressure, including loud British attacks on the forced labor system, Egypt moved to end the corvée, and de Lesseps' company, holding a signed concession, demanded to be paid for the hands it was losing. The dispute went to the most theatrical referee on earth, the French Emperor, Napoleon III. In July 1864, he delivered his verdict. The forced labor would end, and Egypt would pay the company 84 million francs in compensation. The peasants were freed from the trench, and Egypt was billed for their freedom. Our farmer walks home to the Delta, one of the last of the drafted men, carrying nothing but his tools and his month's wages. Then came the strangest twist in the whole story. Losing its unpaid hands is what dragged the canal into the industrial age. The company's contractors turned to iron. Long-armed steam dredgers were floated into sections that engineers deliberately flooded, chewing the bed underwater and lifting the spoil away, because dredging wet ground proved far cheaper than carving dry sand by hand. In the final stretch, from 1867 to 1869, the machines did the overwhelming share of the work. Of the roughly 74 million cubic meters dug out of the canal in 10 years, the mechanical fleet accounted for around 3/4 of it. A project that began with a barefoot man passing a basket up a slope ended as one of the largest steam-powered excavations the world had yet attempted. The desert was losing, and two seas were about to touch. By the summer of 1869, 10 years after the first pickaxe, 4 years longer than de Lesseps had promised, only a last ridge of land held the two seas apart. In August, workers breached the final dam, and the waters met in the middle of the desert. And on the 17th of November, 1869, Egypt threw one of the most extravagant parties of the 19th century. Fireworks and banquets at Port Said, royalty on the guest lists. At the head of the first procession of ships, the French imperial yacht carrying the Empress Eugenie gliding into the new canal, with the Emperor of Austria following in the flotilla behind her. De Lesseps, the retired diplomat the experts had laughed at, stood that morning as one of the most celebrated men alive. France would come to call him the Great Frenchman. But watch where the money goes, because under the fireworks sits the quiet tragedy of the whole affair. Egypt had bled for this canal twice over, first in conscripted labor, then in treasure, its ruler committed to enormous payments, and its treasury sinking into debt to European lenders. Within 6 years, it hit bottom. In 1875, drowning in obligations, Ismail Pasha sold Egypt's entire block of canal shares to Britain, the same Britain that had jeered the project, in a deal seized upon by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli. The trench dug with Egyptian hands and paid for with Egyptian money now answered to boardrooms in Paris and London. Somewhere on the bank, our farmer, older now, watches the steamers slide past fields he was once drafted out of. The water moves, and none of it is his. For Ferdinand de Lesseps, Suez was more than a canal. It was proof of a worldview. The charm, will, and the savings of small investors could redraw the surface of the earth. So a decade after the fireworks, in his 70s, he reached for a second miracle, a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, built, he insisted, the Suez way, at sea level, one long trench, no locks. We tell that full story in our Panama Canal episode. Here, you only need the ending. Panama was everything Suez was not. Mountain rock instead of low sand, a river that flooded instead of a desert that held still, and jungle disease that killed workers and engineers faster than they could be replaced. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary French savers, roughly 800,000 by the end, had poured more than £1 billion into the dream, largely because the name attached to it was the name of the man who built Suez. In February 1889, the Panama Company collapsed into liquidation, and the collapse became one of the great financial scandals of the age. In 1893, France put its hero on trial. De Lesseps and his son Charles were convicted over the ruin and sentenced to 5 years, a sentence never served. It was struck down on appeal, and the old man was spared in part out of deference to his age and to what he had built in Egypt. He died in December 1894, in seclusion, his mind failing, the great Frenchman and the great cautionary tale sharing one body. Suez had taught him that geography yields to conviction. Panama proved that sometimes it refuses, and the canal he did finish was only getting started.
The 20th century turned the ditch into a prize worth fighting over. In 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the same leader whose speeches fixed the corvée's 120,000 figure in national memory, nationalized the canal, reclaiming the artery dug by Egypt's own conscripted farmers and setting off an international crisis that ended with the waterway in Egyptian hands for good. A decade later, war shut it completely. From 1967 to 1975, the canal was a front line between armies, closed for 8 straight years, with more than a dozen cargo ships trapped inside for the entire duration, anchored so long that wind-blown desert sand stained their decks yellow. It reopened. It was deepened and widened, decade after decade, and in 2015, Egypt added a parallel second channel along part of its length so that convoys could finally pass one another. Which brings us back to a sandstorm in March of 2021 and a 400-meter ship parked sideways across the modern world. It took a fleet of tugboats, dredgers gnawing at the bank around her bow, and the extra lift of a rising spring tide to pull the Ever Given free. 6 days to rescue one ship from the sand. It had taken 10 years, and a toll of lives no ledger ever counted, to move the sand out of the way of the ships in the first place. Today, by United Nations trade estimates, roughly $1 in every 8 of world trade and about 1/5 of the world's shipping containers still funnel through that single trench. Men with baskets dug the modern world's throat. If stories like this are why you're here, subscribe to MegaBuilt, how the impossible actually got built.